Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second discussion circle following the series of lectures that I've been giving in polyliteracy. Today, I have three people who've been following the series joining me here, two of them also on the North American continent, but another early riser in China. And I am aware that we have people in Europe and other parts of the world who are wanting to join us, but this time here is not so convenient. So next week I will have this at a different time so that it's more convenient, I think, for people in Europe. But let's go ahead and let the people who are here introduce themselves, say who they are, why they're here, what their interest is in this whole topic, and then we'll get started discussing the set of lectures that I've been giving, and then any other topics that these people would like to discuss with me on related themes. So let us be chivalrous and say ladies first.
All right, my name is Rebecca. I am a high school literature and composition teacher in Wichita, Kansas. I got here via Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I went to St. John's College, which is a great book school, where that's where I really discovered I loved studying languages. But the classes there are less learning the language and more learning about what language is, what is translation, what does it mean to translate. And I really loved that. And then over the years, I kept reading about that and kept studying that, and then thought I should probably actually learn languages at some point instead of just about languages. So went to the Oracle at YouTube and discovered your videos, Professor, and I've been following them for a while and just using them to study languages. So I'm currently studying German and Latin after a hiatus from both for a very long time while I moved and got married and started teaching full time. But I'm primarily interested in ancient languages and ancient Greek, but I'm kind of polyitis on the brink. If I knew more languages, then I would actually have polyitis, but I will eventually have polyitis, and I know that.
You're aiming to catch it.
Yeah, stage 1 polyitis.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. And Christopher, why you are studying anthropology in University of Toronto? Or go ahead. Who are you? Why are you here? What's your interest?
Oh, hi, I'm Chris. I'm a PhD student in archaeology, and I focus on north coastal Peru, and sort of I'm interested in polyliteracy partly because of my own personal interest. I've followed your videos for a long time, but always sort of been hard to sort of really get to it. And I'm in part interested because of personal interest, but also because of my profession, where academic journals, books, reports, they can be in different languages. And it's usually a lot to sort out. And so that's where a lot of my focus is on these days. And I've dabbled with different languages, but really I wouldn't say I'm also kind of polyitis on the brink. Sort of English and Cantonese are my sort of native and home languages, and I'm really mainly focusing on Spanish now. I have some background in Latin, French, and Japanese, but that's sort of regressed because of my focus on Spanish, and I actually do suffer from that whole issue of mixing things up a lot. And so that's my interest here is to sort of learn how to really refine my ability to learn.
Great.
And
Great. And over here we have Chase, who is waking up early in China, and he's got a big mug of coffee there. It looks like he's drinking up, so maybe he's awake now and can introduce himself. Hello, Chase.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I've spent 5 years trying to make the perfect cup of coffee every day, and it still hasn't quite got there yet. So I'll keep working on it for the foreseeable future. And I am a teacher of, what is it right now, film, history, and writing. It sounds more impressive than it really is because it's high school students, but they're, hopefully interested at least in some of the classes. I teach in Beijing, and the last 4 years, basically, right since I graduated college, I've been in China. I spent pretty much all that time learning Mandarin on my own by myself over here, and learning the ropes of just how to learn languages in general while focusing on one language in particular, that still allows you to make progress while still kind of fine-tuning, fixing up a lot of your stuff. And since I got started doing that, however, or I originally got started learning languages not just because I moved to China, had to learn it. I wanted to learn Spanish before on my own. And I started the last 2 years of college self-studying that by myself after having wasted at least 2 or 3 years in high school, doing the quintessential, the typical American high school language learning experience. But I got started learning languages mostly because I just wanted to, I got interested in poetry and at the beginning of college, kind of just by myself. And I thought, well, if you're going to really appreciate poetry, literature in general, you have to read it. It's always better to read it in the original. And so this year, after kind of getting to a point where I'm happy with my Mandarin, I still really want to improve, but getting to a point where I can read literature and express myself pretty well. I started on learning Russian because I like pain, because I've always been interested in Russian culture. And I also have an interest in, as the other two were mentioning, I find more and more that actually, as far as modern languages go, I only really want to learn one, maybe 2, 3 to a high level. And more so, I'm interested in ancient languages, being able to read, per se, classical Chinese, ancient Greek, Latin, being able to read people's thoughts from 2,000 years ago. That's just the historian in me. That just makes me smile, I find that so cool. So yeah, that's where I come from.
Well, birds of a feather flock together. I mean, when we can get a little group like this, where we all are seeing eye to eye on the value of diachronic study, it just boggles the mind that most people don't see that and don't feel that. So it's rather interesting. So I would like if we could maybe go a little bit systematically through the last lectures that I gave on part 2 of Hall's book, and see if you all had any specific questions, either of your own or that anybody else posed that you saw maybe in the forum, in the chat, and then we can discuss that, march through that systematically, make sure we don't miss anything, clarify anything that needs clarification, and then just have a discussion about, I'm curious, I know that Great Books program in Santa Fe also has an Asian section. I mean, they have, like, you can do a master's.
I did that as well. Yeah. After doing my undergrad in the Western canon, I decided to do the Eastern, where actually I studied classical Chinese, but because I didn't know Chinese, I really don't know how much I got out of that. Again, it was like talking about what is a language, what is, and it's especially a language that's so different. So it was fruitful, but not fruitful in that I can now read classical Chinese.
So the part 2 was on the nature of language, and I had about 4 or 5 chapters that I summarized. And again, I'm commenting on this book, and I think when I watched the video after I made it, I realized I spent like half an hour on the whole section of like how do we pronounce older languages, because that's the biggest conundrum that we don't know. So that was all my own addition to the text. But just going through there, I think Chase, you went kind of systematically with a fine-tooth comb, and we had somebody in Poland, Marcin, thank you very much for sending us the Google document that sort of has some questions there. And then Matthew, who was on here last time with me, posed lots of stimulating questions in the chat. So would anybody like to kick off with a question, or of either of your own or somebody else's that we'd like to talk about, maybe clarify, talk about, get our opinions?
Yes, actually, because I did find that there was one question which I asked originally, and then when I was going back a second time through the comments to check, I actually found Matthew asked a very similar question. So I think that's like a 2-for-1, basically. It kind of hit both of those, and it has to do with a section of the text page, if you guys have the PDF, but I also will just read the comment out loud here. I have a copy and paste, page 32 through 34. And the original text goes, it is necessary for us to realize the great role that habit plays in our language behavior and the relatively small share that conscious analysis or reason has in it, so that we may understand the type of work that has to be done in learning a new language. And then this goes on, paraphrasing the rest. Professor Argage was talking about Robert Hall, right? The author. Yeah.
Yep.
He was saying that all knowledge can be broken down to three types: content, attitudes, and skills. Wasn't it skills?
Habits, content, attitudes, habits.
Habits, thank you. Habits.
Yep.
Okay. And then he goes on to say, continuing quote, in learning a new language, the formation of new habits comes before all other considerations. And since the habits of the target language are never those of the learner's language, a special attention must be paid to helping the learner overcome his native habits and acquire the new ones. It is in meeting these problems that linguistic analysis makes its specific contribution to the language learning problem. And skipping along, he gives the analogy of the iceberg, right? So our linguistic activity is like the traditional iceberg, 9/10 of which are submerged beneath the surface of the water, and 1/10 of which is above the surface, gives very little clue as to the nature and extent of the rest. All right, so that's the quote. And the question that I had, and also Matthew had, was if habit formation, and this is not the same, but somewhat similar to Krashen's later idea of language acquisition. Habit formation and language acquisition are two different ideas, but they are both similar in this emphasis on the unconscious, the role of the unconscious in language acquisition. If habit formation and later Krashen's idea of language acquisition is largely unconscious, does conscious study and attention to the systems of a given language, systems as how Mr. Hall defined it, help us more swiftly form these new habits? So do you agree, is habit formation and unconscious, is that the most important part of learning a language at the beginning stages? And two, if it is so, does conscious study and attention to these systems help us more swiftly develop these habits? Yeah.
Well, I recall, when summarizing that kind of information in the slides, I mean, maybe I gave it too short shrift, but I mean, he says that basically, in his opinion, that conscious role there really only comes into play when you meet a specific difficulty and you need to overcome it. That was his attitude, is so that, yeah, I mean, he's talking about literally, he's talking about motor skills. He's making the analogy that it's like learning how to walk. And learning how to talk is like learning how to walk, and learning how to talk in totally new sounds is muscle training for your organs of phonetic organs, and it's also training in a sense of just getting the correct forms. I mean, when you get right down to it, we can put a system, we can develop systems, we can make it look logical, but languages are really kind of just, it's random. Why you have, we make the system when we organize it and put it there. But
right.
There's so many ways that you could say something, and what sounds correct is just the way people say it. And so we organize it and put it there. And so getting that correct feeling, yes, you can sit down after the fact and analyze it, but it's also a question of automaticity. I think that's what he would say. I do think, though, that it can come in, the more highly trained you are, the better you can do it. And so I would say that, I mean, I can refer back to that experience that I had in the Finnish village here when I first came to Minnesota, and I spent 2 weeks immersed in the Finnish village, and it was total immersion, and I was able to develop a fair amount of Finnish in a fairly rapid period of time. But I was not acquiring, I was learning. I was using
Yes.
the teachers
Yes.
as my resource, and they knew that I was doing that, and they were allowing me to do that. And I think I mentioned this in one of the previous discussions. They, it would, if they had a chip on their shoulder, if they weren't comfortable with that, if they didn't know what I was doing, it wouldn't have worked. And so that's why I used the two teachers that I showed in the videos. There were others, and they just weren't comfortable with that. They didn't really know what I was doing. So if I had just been there for 2 weeks, totally immersed, I would have learned something, but I wouldn't have learned nearly as much as I did. But then again, I have so much experience in learning languages and doing stuff. I would know, I knew how I was doing. So I think that if your mind is highly trained and experienced and analytical already, and you have a system that you can refer to, you can learn a lot more. But I think that for your if you don't have that much experience built up, then when you're focusing on the that habit formation time, then yes, then sitting there and overanalyzing it, telling yourself, okay, I know this difficulty is coming up, you're probably going to make an issue for yourself by letting yourself, oh my God, there's something is coming up.
Right.
Chase, since you brought it up, I just was wondering, since this is going to be watched by people, could you, I'm familiar with crashing, but could you kind of define the difference? Like what is acquiring as opposed to learning, since we're talking about
okay. Yeah, sure. Very, and please correct me, Professor, if there's been any changes in this. And honestly, I haven't read a lot of, what do they call it, second language acquisition papers in a while. But according to a researcher, an older, he's now relatively old, an older researcher who developed a theory, who did studies and research in language learning in the late 70s, early 80s. This guy named Krashen developed a theory that we have a part of our brain, basically, that is designed to learn.
Device.
Yes, a language acquisition device, right? Humans, basically, unlike most other skills, like humans are designed, or we, if not 5 million years ago, by now, after using it for so long, humans are designed to learn languages. We have a language acquisition device, a language learning device in our brains. And that as so long as you are understanding messages, understanding ideas expressed through these sounds, these new sounds, you will subconsciously, without knowing it, gradually acquire, that is, be able to use this new language without thinking about it. Basically, automaticity without training. Could I say that much? Or
yeah, you could say. I mean, it's basically saying that that the way that children learn languages is the natural way, and that ideally, even adults, we should do the same thing. I guess if you can boil it down to that, the argument is that acquisition is more effective, more efficient, more natural, has better results, and you can have less pain if you do that. That's the basic.
Right. And to contrast that, maybe you can help me, Professor. What he means by language learning would be sitting down with a grammar book, memorizing vocabulary with Anki. What are some other things? Dictation.
Just conscious study.
Conscious study
is learning.
Conscious study.
Conscious study. So we're doing it unconscious versus consciously. That's the
There we go. Thank you.
I mean, where would something like shadowing or scriptorium fall into that? Because that seems like it's not studying, because you're not looking at like a table of DAS or something like that, but you're really trying to look carefully at what you're being given. You're not just, oh, I understand that message, I'm moving on. There's a slowing down. So where does something like that fall in?
Well, Scriptorium, I would say, definitely is on that learning continuum. That's, it's a form of study. It's using your conscious mind. It's shadowing, as I've talked about, now many times over the years, has many different layers at which you can do it. And there are layers at which it is, it is habit. It is automatic. So on the acquisition spectrum, but there are times too when you're really understanding much what you're saying. So it depends on what kind of shadowing you're doing. So, but yeah, I find, that I think that argument has some validity, but we're not children. And if you are trying to learn like a child, then you are not using your educated, trained mind, which if you have one, is like kind of, you're making it harder for yourself, it seems to me.
Yes.
So if you, if you are, maybe I'll do an interview at some point with a gentleman that I met who's like really learning an unscripted language. So where there is no resource. So like in that Finnish village, I had access to all these Finnish grammars. Why would I not have used those? Why would I not have, prepared the vocabulary that I needed? But if those resources didn't exist, you'd have no option. And then it makes sense to me. But if the resources exist and you know how to use them, why
not?
Yep.
Why not?
Mm-hmm.
Christopher, did you have any questions that came up in your mind that you wanted to like throw out into the discussion?
I guess, yeah, or at least the comment maybe. I think conscious effort is needed because in terms of the input hypothesis, that says nothing to the habit formation of practicing the voice and knowing how to speak words. You're not necessarily going to, for example, like Cantonese, you have so many tones, you're not going to just hear it and then produce it if you're a native English speaker. It takes time to really work those muscles through, and I think that's quite a problem in terms of just assuming that you can. And that's the problem with the whole the start of that chapter about the importance of speech, right? Just as focusing on text isn't the only thing. The speech is also quite fundamental. To grasping everything else. Was it the aesthetic nuances of things? Yeah, and I think that does take extensive amount of practice to get.
Yep. So
a question for Christopher and Rebecca, just after hearing both of those, and for yourself as well, Professor, is after what you were saying about Finnish, and Christopher, since you study Peruvian
Archaeology. Yeah.
Archaeology. Thank you. Peruvian archaeology. Have you studied Spanish?
I have. I
okay.
Have.
I was going to ask, with you guys, like, is knowing when it comes to conscious study now, once you have gotten started with, say, Spanish or these other languages, can you very quickly kind of realize or figure out like what parts of the language are going to give you difficulty, and you're kind of telling yourself, or maybe once you start getting some input and start listening and reading to the language, you kind of in your head, Professor, I think this is what you were like with your Finnish experiment, this seemed very clear to me. This and your lecture on it, this was very clear what you're doing. But Rebecca and Christopher, in your experiences, have you, like, when you get started with a new language, can you very quickly tell, okay, this is going to give me difficulty? And it's not just in my, ahead of time, I'm thinking this is going to give me difficulty, but in reality, it's not. No, it's like, I'm getting started with this language. I'm getting started with Russian per se. And I can tell right now, if you ask me to speak Russian, I could not put together a good sentence because the cases are going to just kill me, basically. But say for tones in Mandarin, for instance, after I had done a little bit of conscious practice, I just was like, no, okay, I'm now going to just focus on input, get a lot of input. And then once I get to a certain level, I'll go back and fix any problems. But yeah, can you guys, like, is it easy to tell where you need that conscious study or not in your experience?
I think overall, yeah, especially if you've tried to learn different languages, exactly where you generally have some problems or deficiencies with. I think a very common one is a lot of people often struggle with grammar. Other people are extremely good at grammar, and that's, where to sort through all the boxes. And yeah, but I mean, as far as yeah, I mean, in terms of input, I mean, I'm not saying input's not important. Input's absolutely important because you're getting the samples in your head of what it should sound like. But yeah.
Yeah, cool.
I think I've gotten, I think in some ways I think I'm still figuring that out for myself, but I think I've gotten pretty decent at looking at materials and knowing this will be helpful or this won't be helpful. I was thinking about this just because recently I tutor a student, and her her parents really wanted her to learn Latin because both of her siblings are learning Latin in school, but she wasn't able to. So I started working on Latin with her, but I'd studied a lot of ancient Greek, but not Latin. So I wasn't worried about studying Latin since it was I was familiar with case systems and things like that. So we got a text that was kind of meant for homeschooling, and for you to be able to learn along with the student. And pretty much like a couple lessons in, I was like, she's going to learn really well with this, and I'm not. And I had to go buy another book for myself because I'm not going to learn any Latin. Because it just wasn't how my brain worked.
Right.
And so like she's doing all this stuff, and she's getting really ahead, and I'm like spending a bunch of time with Lingua Latina, Perseo Estrada afterwards, to make sure that I'm really keeping up with it, because I'm like looking at it's a lot of charts, it's a lot of tables, it's a lot of things, and she's very analytical, so she was great with it, and I was like, no, I'm not going to learn Latin like this. So I mean, I think I've gotten better at that, like being able to look and know, and also just being able to recognize what will actually give me input. I think that's been a huge, and we were all talking about ancient languages, and this kind of goes to the part of chapter 5 with speech and writing, and what you were talking about, Professor, with subvocalization. I think I really want to be able to get back into ancient Greek and studying it, but I feel like I'm stopped because we never really trained pronunciation in college. It was just kind of an appreciation of Greek. And then there's all this discussion about, Erasmian pronunciation or modern pronunciation or different types of pronunciation, and then finding audio for all of these things so you can work on it. I feel like I'm just completely frozen, because I feel like I know what I need to have in order to study ancient Greek, and I don't know where that is. Like, where are those magical resources?
What resources are you using for Greek?
Well, right now I have Greek on pause just because I'm trying to focus on. I have one student who is about to study abroad in Germany, so I'm brushing off my German, really working on German with her, and then I have another student doing Latin. So it's like that's probably enough for now. I mean, I've kind of amassed a collection of Greek textbooks, but Greek textbooks are notorious for being 500 pages of exercises that are 3 words long each sentence. You were talking about the Assimil course, and you were saying that the audio was fine, right? It was one person in the audio.
No, that's Sanskrit. The audio for this, they have come to and I've heard this before. I mean, the reason ancient Greek has all the different accents is that it was a tonal language, so a sense like Chinese. But nobody knows what those specific tones were or how they worked, or what they are. And so these guys have come to I'm sure it's a scholarly conclusion. They've got a reason for it. But they read this and it sounds like they're trying to make Greek sound like Chinese. It's kind of weird. It's kind of strange. So I think that this is an excellent book, but I find the audio hard to work with.
Yeah. And we were talking a little bit in email, Professor, about, well, you could start with modern Greek and then just use modern Greek pronunciation, and then just right. Go with that, because then you have subvocalization. I think you talked about that in your video.
I did, and I would say that you could even maybe do more, at least go and find some Koine Greek, some, biblical Greek is closer to classical, but just, the point is that unless you find somebody who's resurrected, there's no way you can prove that, even the most scholarly argument for restored pronunciation is actually correct, unless you bring somebody back, find some ancient recording, an echo chamber that's still resonating with, the what's her name, the augur's sayings or something, where something. So to me, in a sense, I don't like that solution, as the ideal thing. But, if you were to say, okay, well, at least, some people will understand me, and maybe they'll, I'll get their interest, and it has something to do with that. So, you just make your own sort of compromise with, if you can understand the scholarly arguments for why, this should be pronounced a certain way or that certain way, put that on top of modern Greek rather than on top of English, because I think I am slightly familiar with what you mentioned at St. John's, the idea of like getting an appreciation for the language, not even really trying to learn the language, but just saying, okay, I want to have an appreciation for it, know something of it that's there. And so, yeah, I don't think that they train much of the pronunciation with that. So
yeah, I mean, they don't try to pretend that they do. I mean, what they purport to do, they do a very good job at doing. But if you have interest in, well, I mean, you spend
teach French there, right?
No, you spend freshman year and
Ancient
half
Greek.
of sophomore year doing ancient Greek, and then junior and half of senior year doing French. But again, depending on the tutor in the class and the people in the class, our French pronunciation, we never really quite knew if we were doing it right. And then I went to France, and it turns out we were not doing it right. So, but for a while I could read French decently, but it was pretty haltingly still, just because I had never had a voice.
Yeah, getting the voice is really necessary, and that's what he's talking about in the chapter, and I would totally concur with that.
Yeah.
Christopher, are you trying to eventually setting your sights on something like Quechua or Aymara or
that would be nice.
Yeah,
that would be nice. But yeah, it's finding resources would be the challenge, of course.
Yeah,
and
I actually, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. So what were you saying?
Oh, I was just gonna ask I guess one or two questions then, based off of that. Would it be good to say that if you're getting stuck on whether it's the right pronunciation or not, it's better to just go with one and get, and sort of, even if you're extremely terrible at it, you're getting to sort of absorb parts of it, or is that going to inherently develop bad habits? And we should just start with getting perfect pronunciation and intonations before we sort of move into heavier material.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what my question was, but I didn't actually articulate it as well as you did. Like, what if I'm forming bad habits? Is that, I feel like I get stopped because of that.
Well, what would the bad habits be? If the bad habits were totally mispronouncing the tones of current spoken Chinese, then that would be a really bad thing. Then you'd go there and you'd put a lot of time and work in, and you'd try to speak and nobody would understand you. Okay. But if it's a bad habit in terms of saying, I'm going to get some sub-vocalizations for reading ancient Greek, and what would the bad habit be there? That you would actually meet Plato one day and try to have a conversation with him and he wouldn't get you? I don't think that's going to happen. So I think that when you're dealing with, I don't know. Yeah. You
never know.
You never know. Yeah. I think that, I can just give an example from my own life, is that I don't know what happened with Old Norse, because I studied it and I thought it was the ideal circumstances with, it was just me, a tutor, and one other student. And so it was just two of us. And the professor there, he had spent a lot of time, in Iceland and working on restored pronunciation for Old Norse and everything. And I just, I learned how to read, and I learned how to read the text and do the sagas and look for the symbolism and do all that. But I had just took his sub-vocalization, just used it for whatever it was. And it didn't hurt me at all in terms of my being able to read, understand, and enjoy the sagas and Old Norse literature in general. When I was in graduate school, I was really good at that. I could pick up a text in Old Norse and read it, without a dictionary for the most part by the time I was finishing my dissertation. But I subsequently found out that, my pronunciation was just totally wrong. I mean, it just was not, I don't know why, if I learned it wrong from him or he had some strange thing. I don't know where something went wrong. But when I tried to use that with, tried to say something in Icelandic, you're pronouncing every single sound is incorrect. Everything is wrong. Not one thing you're saying is wrong. So those were bad habits in terms of my ability to converse with, Eric the Red. I should meet him, but it did not stop me from reading the saga of Eric the Red and understanding. Right. So I think there's less danger of this in polyliteracy than polyglottery. So it's good that we're all interested in that.
I will say one, maybe before I was wanting to ask a question, but one kind of potential solution that I thought of after hearing your lecture the other day, Professor, what I plan maybe to do actually with Latin and classical Chinese is, especially with classical Chinese, possibly with Latin, maybe not so much, but with classical Chinese, I have really seriously thought about using one of the other Chinese dialect pronunciations, but I have no intention of per se, maybe I thought about learning Cantonese, but I doubt that I'll actually go through that. But no, nothing wrong with beautiful language. It really does sound beautiful. It really does sound beautiful. But I have seriously thought though about, okay, well, if I have I'm not going to learn Cantonese to a very, very high level, but I do seriously want to be able to read classical Chinese at a pretty, pretty high level. And while it's still not the same, how can I say? While it's still modern Cantonese pronunciation is not how Du Fu or Li Bai was pronouncing things 1,000, 1,500 years ago. It is a modern spoken language where the people are going to be, what do I say? You will be,
Do you know these books?
Yeah. I haven't seen the actual paper versions, but I have seen the one on the left.
They come with audio, and it's classical. I don't know what they're doing, but there's audio for these.
My understanding is that often for classical Chinese they use Mandarin.
Yes,
that was when I was studying it. Yeah.
When I can in school, I'm teaching at a high school at a dual high school right now, so they have Chinese classes and English classes, and they don't even bother teaching it. They just read. It would be just like the Greeks do, basically. They just read classical Chinese with modern pronunciation. That's exactly it. But yeah, if you wanted to, again, and I might just do that, that would be the easiest path. Same thing with what you're saying about ancient Greek with modern Greek. But if you wanted to have a distinctive, if you wanted to try to have a distinctive voice in your head, like for say Latin, then if you know French but you don't have any interest in Italian, well, you could just then use Italian pronunciation. I'm not saying that's the best, but for ones where we don't have a clear standard
or model or living relative
model. But anyways, that's my thought. Could I related to listening, actually, there was a question that I had here about the author Robert Hall on page 29 of his book, when he's talking about speaking and writing, the end of that chapter on speaking and writing. He says, from these considerations, it is evident that the activities of speaking and reading cannot be separated, especially in learning a foreign language. The activity of reading is not independent from speech, but is based on it. We must therefore begin by learning to speak, my emphasis, and then build up our ability to read on our knowledge of the language as it is spoken. And then paraphrasing the rest of this, that's where he then goes on to say, if you really want to read literature, especially poetry, you have to be able to get the voice in your head. And the question I had, and why I put that emphasis on speak, is could we correct the author and say that we must first begin to learn we must first master reading and listening, or listening and reading. And then another one is producing original sentences. That's what I understand by what he means by speak. When I normally say I want to speak a language, I mean produce original sentences. Is producing original sentences that important if one only wants a passive knowledge of the language?
I didn't take it as him meaning that you needed to speak fluently, that you needed to be able to produce original sentences, but that you needed to know how it was spoken. You need to know how to pronounce it. So if you take that, my understanding of that is, as I would comment on that, is if you can, you want to read, you do not need to be conversant. You need to, you can take an Assimil course and shadow it. And if you can do that, you can know how the sounds are made, and then you can put those sounds into the reading. So I don't think that you need to spend a long time learning how to become conversant the way you do in your natural acquisition, where you're learning how to talk for the first 4 or 5 years of your life, and then you go to kindergarten and you learn how to read. He's not saying that. You just need to know that you have the sounds.
Okay.
Rebecca, you look very quizzical right now.
I just have a very loud face. I think some of my issues with things like this, I like that definition because I had the same issue that Chase had when I was reading that, and I was trying to think through what that would mean. But I think sometimes when I encounter things like this, where if you want to do this, you have to do this first. I think that often turns into kind of what we were just talking about before. It allows you so many excuses to just stop entirely. I'm not doing it perfectly, so therefore I have to stop. Or if I finally find the exact method, then I'll finally, be able to learn Italian in 7 days or whatever those YouTube videos that there are. Like I just need to keep figuring out what the key is, and then I can do it, when the key is actually just hacking away at it for a very long time. I put in the comments, kind of with the question that you brought up originally, Chase, my response to Matthew was talking about how I kept encountering Spanish over the years. I grew up in Texas, so I heard Spanish constantly. And then I took 3 years in high school and didn't feel like I learned anything. Then I went to New Mexico, where I was also then surrounded by Spanish. And then I was, I'd studied some French and then really was studying German in earnest. And then was picking up some Spanish books, like readers, and just to flip through them, and found I could read them because I had studied so many other related things and had just been around it for so long. I knew exactly how to pronounce it. I knew so many more words. And then I got really discouraged because at first I just thought, well, did I just pick are the languages I'm picking to study just too hard? Is that what it is? Like, why are these languages hard? But really it's because I had spent years being immersed in Spanish without intending to, without really, and so it was a bunch of comprehensible input, to go back to Krashen. And so whenever I finally started actually looking into it and trying to study it, I found it so much easier because I wasn't starting from square one. And so I think just reminding ourselves of that and saying, okay, well, I want to be able to read. I want to be able to do this. I just need to hack away at it. There's some YouTube video. He hasn't been making videos for a while. I forget his name, like Decaglossi or something. And he talked a lot about,
I know him. Yeah.
And at one point he said, like, he was talking about learning Greek, and he said something like, once you've been able to crawl your way to an intermediate level, because it's just so hard to start out.
Good choice of verb. Yeah, good choice of verb.
Yeah. And I think that we, like, reminding ourselves of that, like, we can keep collecting resources, but you just have to kind of go through them, and you have to really hack at it for a really long time and crawl your way to it sometimes. And then once through that, over the years, you start to figure out better ways of doing that and faster ways of doing that, and you learn how you learn. But it's kind of an exercise in a lot of exposure over a long amount of time.
That's exactly what Hall is trying to get at. I mean, if you just have a big overview of, oh gosh, what am I going to encounter? What are the difficulties going to be, and what can I do to overcome them? But I think you really hit the nail on the head, Rebecca. It's true. I mean, there's always the temptation to think, well, what if I don't seem to be making much progress? What if I had a better method? And then you swim around with different methods or different things. But honestly, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you do something. If there are some things that are the equivalent of just treading water and you'll never get ahead with them, but most things, at least it might not be the best thing, but you're slowly heading forward, and then you'll be ahead. And yeah, as you just said, you'll learn how you learn, and ideally there are resources out there, and you can follow and hit around and say, well, yeah, this works well for me, but there's no need to sort of say, well, I'm not going to start studying until I know what the perfect method is. So Christopher, you look like you had a question mark on your forehead a little while ago.
Yeah, I think I have sort of two comments, like one from just before. I think one analogy, at least for interesting analogy I thought of earlier, was that it's like learning Shakespeare, right? Let's say you're interested in Shakespeare. You don't really how it was pronounced back in the day wasn't exactly how it's pronounced today. And there are a lot of little nuances and wonderful puns and whatnot that are there if you do understand it. But you shouldn't start off with focusing on that, focus on understanding the text, and then you can go into it. And aside from that, I also thought that sort of it was, yeah, it's in terms of materials, I think, yeah, material is sometimes more important than method. And I agree with Dr. Ageas about that. And yeah, I think Matthew touched on this a bit about how, I think he used one of the other quotes about traditional learners sort of managed to just bowl their way through it and managed to be successful via just building habits that way. And for Matthew, it was about how he preferred to watch stories and movies and things like that, and that got him to keep on going. And I think it really does have to, it goes down to our own personalities in many ways. Right?
I think, Christopher, you just gave an excellent example that we all need to keep in mind when we think about this particular, which pronunciation should I be using for ancient Greek or something like this here? Well, we're all native English speakers, and none of us would have any qualms about picking up Shakespeare's sonnets and just reading them with our own voice when we know absolutely 100% that he did not sound like us in the slightest. His pronunciation was enormously different. And there's scholarly arguments for talking about what Shakespearean pronunciation is. And there's this wonderful set of recordings called Acting with an Actors that teaches Shakespearean pronunciation. You can learn that, but nobody would ever think about that or worry about doing it. I mean, Charles Dickens, if you took the Dickens novel, something written in England 200 years ago, you would have no qualms about reading this aloud in your own voice. So that he also definitely sounded very different, very, very different. It's a temporal accent, and back then there was definitely a distinct regional English accent, but we don't have qualms about doing that. I think that really, because what we're doing there is we're enjoying the literature, we're honoring the poetry, we're relishing the richness of the language and the images and the story. And so I think that's what's important to do with any in polyliteracy, any older languages. Honor the text, honor the meaning that's being given, get at what the spirit is trying to say through there, rather than agonizing, oh, am I saying it right? How should I do this? Is this the best way that I should be studying it? So thank you for bringing up Shakespeare, Christopher. That was great. You said you had two questions. So was that one of them, or was that two of them?
Yeah. So sorry, that was the first one. The second one, I guess, is not so much a question, but I guess building on what Matthew said about how some people get through the traditional method, other people get through movies. And often people already talk about this, right? Oh, I watch Netflix and I learn languages. But I think it all really depends on your own mix. And I think Helen Abadazi in one of her videos for the Polyglot Conference mentioned how a lot of polyglots actually make their own material. And so, just because, to use myself as an example, I'm not as interested in Spanish cinema or watching telenovelas until I understand Spanish. I'm more interested in sort of museum displays, catalog books, reports, things like that. And it's very specific to me. And so I think for any learner, that's finding what works for you is actually part of the entire process and not something to simply get frustrated with. It's sort of natural.
You said something earlier that was interesting, Christopher. I mean, you're getting your doctorate in anthropology. And so you said you want to be able to read a lot. So I think that was, in an earlier section of Paul's book, when he talked about one of the reasons for learning languages being scholarly, not a polyliterate, I want to read the thing, but no, I'm a scholar. And I gave the example, I thought he was writing about astrophysicists in the 1960s needing to read Russian. And somebody chimed in, didn't think that was the case anymore, but other people then came to, no, that's very much the case. I mean, today, even, I think he was Russian, a Russian guy said that, he can read English fluent, but he can't speak it. And the same with German and other things, and they've got no reason or need to do so. How common do you think that is still, that there are scholars that, I need to access a scholarly journal, but I don't need to speak it?
I think it's actually still quite common. And that also applies for anyone who studies a region where scholars from a different country were working there. I think, for example, where I work in Peru, in the North Coast, there were a huge number of German scholars back in around 1910s to 1960s, and that sort of stopped. But most of that original material, or original excavation reports, all that stuff, there's no other way to access it unless someone decides to translate several dozen pages. So that's still, even though I might not want to learn German so I can go to Berlin, I might still have to know enough, at least just to get by, just to know the material, because no one's necessarily going to translate that for me in full. So that's always the challenge. Older material, legacy material is always there too. Collections are not always in the same language that most scholars now today are. Most scholars in Peru speak Spanish, know Spanish, will write in Spanish. That wasn't the case. And I think there are also Japanese scholars where I work, and they've published small numbers of articles in Japanese, but the majority of Peruvian scholars are not going to be able to read that. So the little nuances when you're at the sort of going for that really tiny specialist kind of areas.
I hope you can get some Quechua spoken resources now. Many long years ago, I went to Peru for various reasons, but I was looking for Quechua resources, and I got lots of books, but I could not find anything recorded. And I knew that, like, I hiked the Machu Picchu Trail, and I knew that the porters were speaking Quechua among themselves, but when I would go near them, they would not speak it. They would switch to Spanish. And I was staying with a host family, and the mother there said that she knew Quechua. I mean, she was a native Spanish speaker, but she said she knew it. And I asked her to record something for me, and she couldn't do it. She wouldn't do it. So I was absolutely total failure in getting any sounds of Quechua while I was in Cusco and that area of Peru. I know now that again, that site I referred to, Faith Comes by Hearing, they've got like dozens of different kinds of Quechua translations of the Bible, but in terms of getting somebody to speak to you, I don't know if you've tried that. Have you been there and tried to do that?
Yeah, so for me, there's a little additional layer to it, because I don't work in the highlands, I work in the coast. And it's an area where the Inca conquered, and there's actually another language called Muchik. So the ancestors. There's actually multiple layers, and it is hard to get. Well, I mean, if you have friends or things like that, then that would make it easier. But I think a lot of the times, the challenge is that it's like for a lot of people who go to other countries, if somebody knows English or they know Spanish or whatever it is, they might just want to switch back and like, oh, you don't have to, or they don't want to be bothered. And I think it takes time to really get the people to open up sometimes. Just, yeah, so.
This actually touches on a question about, what is it? I had about his layers of, what do you call it? His layers of, how does he have it? Dialectical divisions in a language. Dialectical divisions in the language. In the chapter later on, Professor, I think it's chapter 9. I forget the last chapter that you were.
Right. Formal, informal, standard.
Yes.
Standard.
Yes. Yes. He has the quote where he divides, just again, paraphrasing this time, I won't read the whole thing, where he divides, he says languages, within a language, we all have these different standards that we adhere to. And he gives the one formal standard, which would be in English, I guess, formal written, like a speech or something like that, maybe. Informal standard. So I'll just read the examples he gives. Formal standard, it is, I have none, he departed. Informal standard, it's me, I haven't any, he went away, between you and me. Informal non-standard, I ain't got none, he beat me, he took it on the lamb, you and me better go home. Took it on the lamb, I like that actually. And 4, formal non-standard, a variety which arises when those whose normal speech is informal non-standard try to speak formally and create forms or combinations which no standard speaker would ever use on any level, i.e. between you and I love he gives that example. I love that he gives that example because I have heard that. Anyways,
I've noticed that I gave that example too. I swear, honestly, the English language has changed in my stay abroad, and I hear people who are educated using pronouns in a totally wrong form, him and I. People say that. I hear that kind of thing more and more often. Rebecca, you're an English teacher, right? You're a high school teacher. Do you notice your students doing this?
Well, I mean, I was thinking about this because I'm still pretty young. I'm in my late 20s, and you were talking about people putting the T in often, and I was thinking, I think I do that. Is that wrong? Do people do that? Yeah, and like I like suddenly like couldn't even remember how I said a word.
That's why I said he gives that classic example that native speakers often have an idea that something is right, or and they're totally wrong. They think it's something's one way and it's not, you know. So, so like then I make you conscious of this and you're worried about it. Like, I say that, you know.
Do I say that? And the thing is that like with the teenagers are so good at coming up with adolescent standard, which isn't formal or informal. It's its own thing. I was speaking of this with my student who's learning German, and she was saying that she was talking with another girl who is German, who studied abroad in the States. And all teenagers now have done this thing where on their phones, they've taken off capital letters. So even in German, where you would capitalize nouns, not only the beginning of letters, but you'd capitalize nouns as well as a few other words, they just write in all lowercase, and that's what's considered appropriate. And it's considered weird if you're a teenager texting another teenager and like capitalizing things. So I mean, being a high school teacher, that's, I mean, Chase can talk about this. It's just teenagers are a different thing as far as language goes. But yeah, I wonder with my own speak. I was saying, you know, do I say often correctly? I read so many books when I was younger, but I wasn't necessarily around a lot of highly educated people, and so I grew up saying words incorrectly, like, you know, facade.
Yes.
That's a classic example of facade. Yes. A friend of mine was talking about, he was in a similar situation, and he had this great word that he read about, and it's, if someone takes you in the wrong direction, he misled you, and he just didn't understand why no one used it. MISLED, misled. Misled. It's a great word. It's a great word. Why doesn't anyone use that? And so I think there's this. Yeah, I mean, I'm rambling at this point, but there's definitely things that as I've gotten older and read more and interacted with different groups of people, I've become very conscious of, thinking I definitely say many things wrong. And I'm still considered highly educated, but there's a lack of formality in our culture right now anyway, that, you know, you were saying highly educated people saying him and I, or whatever it is. So at that point, what is formal and what's informal, what's correct and what's incorrect? That was a big question I had with this chapter, with what is meaning and what is correct or not.
And the specific question I had about this that is very related to what she is saying was, when we are at the beginning stages of learning a language, and especially, I know you're Professor, I think I know your basic perspective on this, but especially for like a language situation like Arabic is an extreme example, but even with less extreme examples, like I've heard with Farsi, I know their written and their spoken language is quite divergent, or even with Mandarin, I can tell you written Chinese, probably because they were writing in classical Chinese up to modern times, and so they've had less time to get a written. Written Chinese is very different at times from spoken Chinese. When we're at the beginning stages of a language, what type, formal standard, informal non-standard, what type of these should we try to model ourselves on? Assuming you don't have one specific interest with the language. So for instance, you don't just want to speak to people. If you want to just speak to people, obviously, I think you don't really, that's not a question at that point. Informal standard or informal non-standard, sure. Or if you just want to read, right? If you just want to read, fine. But if we want a general, like your level in French or Spanish, for instance, like a comprehensive, just wide around, I can read whatever I want, I can listen to whatever I want, I can handle myself in any situation, formal or informal at this point. At the beginning, what should we try to model ourselves on? And then once you've reached like a comfortable intermediate and advanced level, can and should we change the focus of our emulation? So once you've gotten to the level where, hey, I can understand whatever I want in Spanish at this point. Now from my expressing myself now, maybe I want to try to express myself a little more, if you were formal before, informally, or if I was a little more informal before, formally. Yeah.
I think you should always aim for formal standard speech as a learner. I mean, that's what people appreciate. That, yeah, Hall had a quote there that, you know, people really have different standards of foreigners than they have for other people. And that's, you know, you're never going to offend somebody or, you know, do something wrong if you go with that. You might sound a little bit old-fashioned and stilted, but they kind of appreciate that. That's been my experience out there in the wider world as a whole. So I think you, as a learner, that certainly at the beginning stages, you have to always emulate formal, you know, the most formal standard speech you can. And then, yeah, I mean, I would say never sort of consciously say, okay, I'm good enough. Now I'm going to switch to the, you know, to the slang and the dialect. But if that happens to you because you enjoy reading novels that have a lot of language like that, and you pick it up by listening to audiobooks, and if you actually live there and know people that speak that way, and if it comes naturally, then you know, and it doesn't sort of erode your formal standard skills, then okay. But I would never see a reason to switch away from that. Christopher, what did you say that you were? How did you get to coastal Peru? I mean, how often have you been there? How do you get there? What do you do there?
Oh, okay. So it's so Lima's on the coast, and so where I work is the uppermost part of Peru, by the coast near Ecuador, and it's the Moche that I work on, and so. Yeah, I actually partly it's kind of related to the language thing. I was originally interested in classics, and I had learned a bit of Latin in high school, but then when I got to university and I started taking classes, I hit that whole dry classical Latin. I was going through like Wheelock's Latin and just doing drills all day, and that just killed my interest. And I sort of ended up in another part. And I sort of was interested in the Near East, but then I had to learn Arabic, but I also had to learn several more languages. And so I sort of kind of weaved around, and I met one of my professors who had this project going on, and I sort of went to that, and so that's how. So it's sometimes language can be barriers, but it can also be kind of direct us to other things that we might. Where we might find language not to be as big of a challenge, because if we're interested in the topic enough, I guess. So,
Rebecca, could you tell us something about your master's program in the Eastern Great Books at St. John's? I think you can do either a Sanskrit track or a Chinese track, right?
Yeah, you can do a Sanskrit or Chinese. My husband had done it a couple of years before I did. And so we had all the Chinese books. And so rather than buying lots of very expensive Sanskrit books, I decided to do Chinese. And because I wasn't sure, I hadn't read enough of the text to really know which of the cultures I would want to really read. And it turns out I wish I had taken Sanskrit, but that's neither here nor there. I could still do that otherwise. But it's a 3-semester program, and it's the great books of China, India, and Japan. The seminar would reading things in translation and English and discussing them like this, meeting twice a week, discussing the texts. Then the language tutorial, either classical Chinese or Sanskrit, and then the preceptorial where you spend several weeks on one book, really focusing. So like the last summer of the program, you spend the entire summer, 8 weeks, reading the Tale of Genji with a group of people. So it was a really fruitful thing to study, especially after doing 4 years of the Western canon. You start off with the Greeks, and you're reading Plato and Homer, and you're studying Greek, and then you work your way up into the last people who mattered. So like the 1920s. We don't know if they're great books, if they were written in the 50s. So it was really fruitful for me, and just the questions that were asked. I mean, this also, I guess, kind of goes to the chapter 8 meaning. When you're studying another language, you start to realize some of the questions you might have aren't questions that other people have, because they just don't exists. Maybe the way that the reason you have a question is because of something you're formulating. I heard someone say that you can't translate Anselm into Chinese because the whole argument rests on I think being or to be or how he formulates how God is, and so you just can't translate it into a bunch of languages, and so he doesn't have an argument in some languages, which made me feel comfortable after I read it, and someone didn't like it.
I actually heard a whole lecture one time by this Chinese professor on on like a part of a longer series, but he was talking about, how being. Yes, this seems like it's a very simple term, but then like 100 years ago, when these Chinese guys were trying to translate like a lot of these Western classics for the first time, they're like, how do we do this? What is this word? Yeah, being. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Sorry.
And that's what we ran into with a lot of the Buddhist texts, especially getting into Zen Buddhism, where we were reading it and we're like, I have no idea what they're talking about because they're making distinctions between things I've never made a distinction between. And so it really, even though I don't know if I understood the text, it really got me out of my very Western way of thinking, even without learning the language, trying to see different ways of looking at something. It was the same type of thing as, just learning about, I think his example in the book is something about how we say I have, and then in Russian it's like to me it is, right, or something. It's just, even if you don't learn Russian, you can still see, there's different ways of showing possession of something
so basic that you would just assume, it's the same, and then that's the point he's making. Yeah, it's pretty much the same. It's exactly the same in German. It's pretty much the same in French. So, if you're a native English speaker, you start out thinking it's normal, it's natural. But then when you start going more exotic, you realize, hey, something so basic, something so fundamental is not. Yeah.
When it comes to these classical languages, guys, I'm curious now because I haven't actually, as I said, my interest now does lean as I've kind of gotten more serious and specific about what I exactly want with languages. I've kind of realized, well, hey, my focus does lean more towards polyliteracy and the ancient languages, but I have not actually seriously got started studying one yet. I have. I don't want to pull off the books down here, but basically my whole bookshelf is Chinese. So I have tons of classical Chinese ready to go. But I'm curious for the other languages that I haven't got started on, like ancient Greek, Latin, or Sanskrit, as you were mentioning. In your guys' experience, assuming one wants this knowledge of the ancient languages, you were saying, Professor, of course, it's helpful if you first learn the modern variant. And now with my experience with Mandarin, I 100% support that it will do nothing but help you. It will do nothing but help you. My question is, how, assuming one's main focus is the ancient language, like this is my kind of conundrum with Greek, for instance. I am interested in modern Greek, somewhat interested. I'm really interested in ancient Greek. Ancient Greek is the meat on the table there.
This was your Greek exact question, was it not, Rebecca? That she wrote to me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Question. Yeah.
Okay. Here
Trace and I were emailing each other, before we were planning.
We wanted to set up. But Greek, because Greek really is a great example of this, because the other, like with the Latin descendants, these are continental spanning languages. With Chinese, it's half a billion people. Like there's practical reasons you could add to the argument, but Greece, bless its heart, it's got personality. It's a small country on the Mediterranean, beautiful. I might want to retire there, but practically speaking, it's nothing. And the literature, while substantial in modern Greek, again, if I'm comparing it to something like French or Spanish, if I had to choose between the two, anyways, but assuming one's main focus is the ancient language and one is considering whether or not to learn the modern language, is it always a good rule of thumb, in your opinion, that if you have even the slightest interest, slightest chance you might want to learn the modern variant, you should learn the modern variant first, then work backwards. Like, unless you are just absolutely 100%, you're not on the border, you're 100%. I have no interest in any of the Chinese variants. I just want to learn classical Chinese. I have no interest in modern Greek. I just want to learn ancient Greek. If you're ever on the fence whatsoever, it's always a good rule to start from the modern first and then work back. Would you say, what are your guys?
It would always give you that voice to subvocalize, give you one. But again, I would just think about, I mean, it's not a way around that question, but sometimes there isn't just one modern descendant. I mean, if you were to try to say that with Sanskrit, okay, which modern Indian language should I learn? It's not Hindi, it's not Marathi. I mean, is there one? I want to do that with Latin. Which should I start with, Italian or French? I mean, then you learn them all and then you never get to Latin. So, so I don't know if it's necessarily a good reason, rule of thumb. If you need something to subvocalize, that can give it to you. And you could just, again, as I said, you could just take it as far as saying, okay, if I can get a good recording of it and shadow that, and then I can make those sounds and I have this to follow along, then I could go to the ancient language. So I think it's sort of like that earlier question about learning to speak before you learn how to read. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to have a conversation. I think it might mean, okay, if I want to have something to subvocalize, and then give me something to do.
And half the vocabulary, and half the vocabulary.
Yeah.
Vocabulary.
A facilitated structure and
yeah, a facilitated structure, yeah. And cultural knowledge.
Right. But you don't want to get have Chris's experience of like having your interest killed by, you know, by doing something that, you know, is going off in the wrong direction.
Right.
Oh, so Rebecca, I'm really glad to meet somebody who's been through the entire St. John's curriculum, from undergraduate through master's degree. And so has that richness of the great books tradition there from that. Christopher, what's your interest in great books and that kind of thing?
I'm interested in, I've always been interested in terms of sort of theoretically speaking, because a lot of the great books are the basis of a lot of philosophical or theoretical ideas that are quite important in anthropology. And so that does, and I think a lot of older scholars always use analogies based off of the great books. And yeah, even if we've moved past, let's say, even Freud, we're still using terminology and aspects that will be brought into discussion. So,
yeah. But if I may ask one thing, this is, I don't want to make this like a personal consultation or a personal psychology, but as a person who didn't want to get into teaching, or didn't plan on getting into teaching, I majored in film in college, and I'm teaching film now, so it's somewhat related, right? But as one now who has been in teaching, has seen both the good and a lot of the bad, I'm curious because I've been thinking about what I'd like to do in my life in the future, and obviously having found out, well, hey, I'm very interested in the humanities, interested in languages, interested in history. I might want to write some books on history. I'm interested in writing. I might want to write my own novel in the future. Obviously, I don't expect to get paid for that, but I'm curious, as a person who is very interested, wanting to work with, devote a lot of my life to the humanistic just education and bettering myself and all that. With your three guys' experience, having two of you, I guess, having worked extensively in academia, and Rebecca, going to St. John's, I kind of forgot at the beginning if you said now, but having kind of experience with that. My impression of modern academia, I must say, is not very, maybe I've read too much Chuck's Barzun, but it's not very flattering a lot of the times. To be fair, he's very balanced in his critique, but like for a person who's interested in languages as themselves as a means of study. I obviously now have heard, Professor, from a lot of your comments and from other people's, that modern linguistics is not the place for that. Like, it's not necessarily discouraged. I don't know if it is. It's not necessarily discouraged, but it's not encouraged. And just academia as a whole, in your guys' experience, like, if my primary interest is in say like I want to write a book on history, I want to write an interesting, book on ancient Chinese history to a general reader, right? Or I want to, go on and study and maybe make some comparisons between similar classical Chinese, like how did it evolve into the modern dialects, right? What were some differences there? Or what is ancient Chinese philosophy? Where is it similar? Where is it different with ancient Greek philosophy? Like these kinds of questions. Again, and writing them, important here, writing them to a general reader, not just for the thesis chamber. I haven't done my face. I haven't done.
Do you need to go back to graduate school to do that? Is that your question? Do you need to go back? Do
I need to go back to graduate school, and is academia the place? Modern academia, is this the place for this kind of? Or could I just do this? Like, could I instead? My other consideration right now. Go and study engineering, make a lot of money for 5 or 10 years, retire early, and then and then
that's
do
what
all
Heinrich
this stuff on my own.
Schliemann did, didn't he? Christopher Heinrich Schliemann.
He made a lot of money.
Troy.
I don't know if you want to base your life off of Heinrich Schliemann.
Schliemann does have, if you look it up, he actually does have his own story about language learning. He actually apparently, I think God's Graven Scholar by I think
Serum.
He used was it Theocrates or something like that, and he used to hire somebody just to yell at them while he tried to learn a language, and it would I think he got kicked out once from a place that he was renting.
I mean, wasn't he was married to a Russian woman, and then he wanted to live in Greece, and she said, I don't want to live in Russia. I would only want to live in Russia. So he divorced her and then like put an ad in the paper for a Greek wife.
He did.
Greek-speaking wife who wants to be here. So.
Yeah.
I mean, Chase, what I was going to say is that you were saying, where can I have discussions about language learning and humanism and stuff like that? And I wanted to point out that you're doing that at this exact moment. And so, I mean,
this is what thank you guys. This is exactly what I want. You literally, I'm getting this for free. You guys are doing what I have wanted to do for like 2 years. This is great. Continue. I'm sorry.
And these things exist. I think it's just, we sometimes forget it, or we want the official version or whatever it is. I've started noticing in my life, I'm finding more and more that I'm having these things because I'm creating opportunities for these things. So, I mean, the fellows in academia can tell you more about that, but my vote is that you're already doing it, and just keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks.
I guess from my perspective, I'm still arguably a novice because I'm working on my PhD. But yeah, it's I would say that depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a tenure track position, that's going to be a long ride. But if you're looking for what it can give you, is sort of understandings of what counts as rigor in terms of research. And so you don't necessarily need to have it to write for the public, but if you want to get as much information as you want to, and you're not necessarily just in it for trying to get a really good tenure track job, and then that's then I think it can help you. Just make sure if you do go to grad school, make sure it's fully funded or something, so we don't have to worry about that.
If I go to grad school, I've already thought this out. I'm going to do it in Russia, China, anywhere but an Anglo country, because the prices.
The learning itself, as Christopher was saying, is just, when you have access to, libraries, and you get the studies and, just the rigor and knowing this, I mean, that the mental training is invaluable, but just as in linguistics, somehow got away from languages. I mean, even the study of something like comparative literature, it's almost like you're not allowed to enjoy the literature as such. You need to use it in a polemical, tendentious way. You need to somehow take it and show that, that I don't know, like what transgender identity was in 8th century BC India. And that sounds like a very modern argument, but you've got that there. And then you have to show, well, my interpretation is right, and this other Marxist interpretation
is wrong. And
So,
nothing wrong with
yeah.
that if that's what you want to do. But the point is I don't want my professor, or who's the guy who oversees the people. I don't want this person to say, hey, you better add some, some feminism in ancient India. I think that's looking good. Yeah. Looking good for the next.
Find a good advisor, because there are lots of different academics with different focuses, right? If you find one that leans more to what you're interested in, they're going to be able to help you more.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thanks.
We've been going on for I think over an hour now. I don't know if people are going to watch all of this. So Chance, that was your.
But we
big,
had a good time.
that was your big long question. Let's let Christopher and Rebecca have one final question or word or comment or something.
Sounds good.
I guess, Rebecca, you could go first.
I'm trying to think. If you have one, go.
Well, I
Trying to
guess
think of
just, I guess I just I guess one more question would be, I think I've really gotten into the Asimil series as well.
Mhm.
And I was thinking sort of, when it comes to using those, or even the use of older resources versus new resources, is it better to use older resources first to build a foundation and then start with the new one and then go to the new ones, or vice versa, because of how language always changes according to Hall? So
like for you, learning how to read German that was written between 1910 and 1960, there's absolutely no problem using the 1950s Asimil. That would be perfect. That would be better for you. You don't need to use the latest. And unfortunately, even there, I mean, as a general rule, the older ones are somehow better, more solid, just more, just as, better things to work with. So I don't know that you have to go through. What do you have there?
I got conversational Russian, Cortina method, conversational Russian in 20 methods. And I must say, this was a very, very good review by yours.
Yeah, that's an excellent one. That is excellent.
Yes.
Cortina's Russian. Yeah.
And I found audio for that online recently, because I had the German one and read through it. But then there's someone who, I just searched for it, and someone's uploaded audio for all of the Cortina books. So you're able to actually shadow and actually work on the sub vocalization.
Really?
Yeah,
Like modern with modern quality, right?
Some of them are not, but
recording quality.
Some of them are just digitized versions of the old like cassettes or records. But I think the Russian actually was recently re-recorded. I saw on the website, so you should look into that. If I have a link, I'll try to send it to you before we head out.
Yeah, thanks.
They seem like a mixed bag, because the Japanese one is actually very bad. I think if you try to listen to it, it has that classic sort of the 1950s accent layered on top.
Yeah.
Okay, that was your question. So yeah, you can stay with the 1950s. Okay. Rebecca, final question from you.
Okay, well, I have another question about that. Made me think about Asimil, because you can find just dozens of videos on YouTube of like how I use Asimil, and they make Anki cards out of the individual audio files and things like that. How do you use Asimil, Professor? And how would you suggest someone starting off in a language? How would you suggest that they use it? Because I know that they have their thing with passive wave and active wave, and some people use that and some people don't. What do you suggest?
If the spirit of somebody like some of the people who are on commenting on if you posted this in the comments, somebody would come up and say, I answered this in this video or this post forum, back, in 2009, go read that. I did answer that very thoroughly. I don't remember exactly what I said. Because it's been actually a long time since I've started out learning a brand new language and done that. But basically, I would say the most important thing is that you literally religiously give it that 15, 20 minutes a day minimum. I mean, make sure that it's totally systematic in what you do, and just, build in waves of reviewing. Don't think you need to master the whole thing as a whole. I mean, what I started out in this new incarnation of making videos, again, get rid of the gaps so that it's just non-stop recording, and then you'll have like 2 hours maybe of solid recording. You don't need to master lesson 1 before you get on to lesson 10, because you can go back and do it in various ways. So think of it as that the text and the sound as being something that you're going to absorb and digest over time and get to know better and better and better and better. And when you have totally digested it, you will have a solid foundation in the language. So yeah, I can dredge up somewhere, or when I don't know, maybe it's Matthew or somebody will see this, they'll say, okay, yes, they'll be able to point exactly where I answered that. But I know that I gave that some thorough consideration. But I'd be happy to talk about that with you further if we can't find it.
Well, I figured you had probably answered it before, but before I watched every single video, I thought I would ask. But and that goes back to the conversation, what I was saying about Spanish, just like constantly being in the language and hearing it and getting exposed to it and understanding more and more.
Right.
You just have to keep at it. It's not, there's not some sort of specific way. If you use asimil in this way, then you'll get the language. So yeah, so I mean, yeah, what you said makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you three for joining me in this discussion circle. And I hope it's always interesting and fun to meet people who share a similar interest and be able to share my experience with them. I'm very happy to have this sort of personal touch here in this strange new world that we live in, where, you know, we meet each other, not in reality, but in Zoom, but it works fine for something like this. So I just hope again that this makes as interesting watching for others as it was for us to be here. So we'll find out. For those who are still watching this all to the end, as I said, next time I'll do it at some other time of the day so that we can get some European or other people in here. And also I realized that the reason my cat is so
There's
active
Merlin.
is
He has to make an appearance every video. He has to make an appearance.
Right. This is his dinner time. He's saying, "Would you stop talking and come give me my dinner?" So,
My cat is right outside the door doing the same thing, but she's so loud that I had to kick her out of the room before this started.
okay. All right. Well,
Christopher, me and you have to get a pet soon. Me and you have to get a pet soon.
We do.
We're missing out.
Right.
Anyways,
Yeah. Thank you very much,
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye.